Today on the Block Party Show, Jmtowin and I break down the Week 4 DFS slate from a GPP perspective. We'll go through all of the top plays at each position, and then we'll finish by building a lineup on Draftkings to get you all set for the week as we all attempt to take down these tournaments. Let's do it.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, 35 bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right, JM should be here in a second. I got a message from him at the last minute saying his internet went out and he would be here in a second. So you guys are stuck with me solo for the first few minutes here before we get rolling. Shout out to everyone in the chat. We got Big Dan, we got Sean, we got Nez, we got GA. Bart, will JM have clothes on? Maybe his power didn't actually go out. Maybe he is derobing right now. And when he pops on, we will all be in for a total treat here. We got copper prices. Ross also wants JM to be naked. Frank is excited for the show because I'm falling into a Raider stack with Jimmy G, so I'm going to lose all my money. Real quick before I forget here, this is the first week the Deposit Kingdom tournament hasn't filled by showtime. So we do have 99 spots left. The link to this is in the Deposit Kingdom Discord in the announcements channel. So if you're watching this right now on playback, if you're not in the Deposit Kingdom channel, that is where it is exclusively posted. So hop in there, go to the announcements section. Let's get this filled up. We've been able to raise the entries by 50 each week. So let's keep that rolling. And without further ado, he is wearing clothes. Everyone was wondering, would JM be coming in here naked today? How are you doing, JM?
I didn't have time to get naked dealing with internet connection. So I'm not wired in. I'm using Wi-Fi. So if there are any little miniature lags, it's because of that. Strangely, it was my wired connection that cut out, but Wi-Fi is still working.
Well, hopefully we will we'll be able to power through this. It seems what did Levitan always say? You had that hemp internet?
The hemp connection to the internet. I came here in my canoe and I've got my hemp connection to the internet. So yeah, I'm ready to go.
Do you still self-identify as a hippie?
I said something. Oh, it was on my show with CSU Ram last week. Talking about looking up at the stars and just remembering how small we are and how little money matters. And I said, that's pretty hippy dippy stuff, but it is also very true. So, I think that my background as in fiction writing and as big reader and all that, it's very different background than the typical DFS bro. So yeah, I guess in this world of DFS, I would be considered a hippie.
I always enjoy that stuff. I thought Jonathan Bales, back when he was writing and blogging more, he would always blend that stuff. I think he even wrote about it once too, where he called it like idea sex, where you take something from a completely different place, whether that's fiction or science or another discipline, and then you find those things that you can apply to fantasy. Even like Rotoviz Sean Siegel, who kind of popularized zero RB, he was reading Taleb talking about anti-fragility and like had this epiphany of like, holy cow, this is a concept we can apply to fantasy. So I always appreciate those kind of musings.
Yeah. It's funny in my show with Keegan right before this, the DFS Lab show, which actually cut out at the very end. Well, one of the things he'd asked about was, how do you select rosters and in terms of like this fear of, hey, maybe this is the roster that's going to hit. I'm changing things on this, and I was saying that the mental side of DFS is one of the most interesting components. And I said to him something I've said before in other spaces, but you could play DFS for 5 years, especially NFL DFS, where you have the full week to kind of think through things. You can play it seriously for 5 years, really dedicate time and attention to it, and be a losing player and make so much more money in other areas of your life as a result of those 5 years of DFS play. Really does like sharpen your understanding of how to hunt for upside and how to raise your economic ceilings. One of my favorite things about DFS is you can lose money, but it trains your mind so much in terms of how you can use it in other areas. So yeah, DFS is a very interesting, it's not just sports. We know that, right? Most of the top DFS players are very good at math, very good at whether it's finance or advanced analytics or whatever it is. game theory. But yeah, it's a cool way. It's a cool space for blending thoughts and ideas, and you can take thoughts and ideas from DFS and blend them into other areas of life as well.
So how speaking of getting in touch with the stars and if God is shining his face upon us, how did your week 3 go? I know a lot of the 1 week season family had another big week. How did you end up?
Yeah, it was God's face did not shine on my roster fully, but it was a weird week where I had to remind myself, I always say like process over results, and I knew Sunday morning that I was 3-0 on the season, just in terms of, was it a good week of prep and play and all that. And so I had to remind myself on Monday, Tuesday, because when you have a losing weekend, and I didn't finish down much money, but finished down just a little bit coming off of back-to-back winning weekends, you can start to press a little bit more or change your process. So I had to remind myself, like, approach this week the same as you would if I had 3 main builds and one of them was like top 5% of contests, but the 2 that I put more money behind both finished like with the bubble touching the cash line, right? So it's like, well, one little thing goes differently and those bubbles are in the cash line. You finish up a couple grand instead of down a couple grand, and your mindset would be different. So it was a week where I had all the top 6 wide receivers were my 6 highest owned wide receivers. All the top quarterbacks were my highest owned quarterbacks, but didn't have the Bills defense and didn't have enough of the Dolphins backfield, and didn't have, like, it just didn't land on the right rosters sort of thing. So it was one of those weeks where, like, it was and I said it last week, it was not a week that set up well for me. And in the past, it would have typically been a bad week. So I was very happy with my play, very happy with the position I put myself in. If we played out that slate 100 times, I would have finished up money on it, not substantial money, but up money. So it was a good week. Didn't show up in the bank account, but I felt good about it.
Did you have any takeaways from the Devon Achane performance, just from like a process standpoint? I mean, I know he was very, low owned across a ton of contests, so it wasn't like, he was a tough decision point, but is there anything we can look back on that and learn from, just seeing, one of probably the biggest running back, score we'll see all season, and none of us got it on our DFS lineups?
Yeah. One of the things that, Cubs fan used to always, he would text me on a Sunday morning and be like, who's the number 4 receiver for this team, or who's the backup running back, and look at Squirrel Patrol, who I have my Friday Roto-Grinder show with. He won it was a 2-game slate, but he won a Millie Maker a couple of weeks ago with the backup running back from both teams. And you end up with injuries and that type of game. And obviously that's a 2-game slate. It's a little bit different, but in terms of, we never want to be taking guys who can't break the slate. We know that. And so we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, I think, on this show, of there can be a tendency to be like, oh, this guy's low owned. And it's like, yes, he's low owned because there's a lot more risk on him. And he's 5,200. And if he hits, he gets you 20 points, right? Like, that doesn't separate. So if the guy's low owned, if it's more risky, you want the guy who can be like, man, you really had to have that guy. So Achane was interesting because that's not something I'm good at, is finding the backup running back who can have a good game, right? And that's not my strength, but I've learned since I've started doing MME last year, I've learned to always ask those types of questions of who on this team could put the slate out of reach, and try to get 2%, 3% of those guys, right? Because I'm going to have, last week, it was like over 40% Justin Jefferson and Mike Williams, 25 to 30% of Amari Cooper and Keenan Allen and Tank Dell. Like, so if I have those guys as my core, and then you're mixing and matching in these kind of 2 to 3% owned guys who can have those monster games. Well, on a week like last week where my core hit across the board, you have that chance for Achane to end up on one of those rosters. But I mean, Achane also outscored Mostert by like 10 points, right? And Mostert was somewhat popular. So in that context, he wasn't as big of a difference maker as he would have been without Mostert also hitting. But I do think, especially if you're playing the Millie Maker, and that's one of the reasons I don't play it, is because that's not my strength, is to look for those types of plays. And I'm better suited in MME to something like the slant with 26,000 entries instead of 200,000 entries. But in MME in particular, you always want to kind of be asking those questions. In the larger MME, the more so, like, who is the guy who could put the slate out of reach, and what's the story that would be required for that to happen? Nobody sees 70 points coming, but you want to account for kind of what could realistically happen. And Achane certainly fell into that category of, it could realistically happen. He could get 12 to 14 touches and hit some long runs. So yeah, not a huge takeaway for me, but it was a very interesting setup that week.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, this happens with everything, right? It always looks obvious in hindsight. You're like, oh, they're missing Jeff Wilson, Devon Achane. Achane had already been activated. He's clearly going to get some touches. Mike McDaniel drawing up this awesome run scheme, one of the most explosive, concentrated offenses in football, going against one of the worst defenses in football. Like, how did we not have him in? But it's so much easier to do that in hindsight. Let's do kind of a macro overview of this week for slate. We do have kind of one extra game off of the main slate this week with the Falcons Jags playing in the morning in London. I'll pull up the Fantasy Life Game Hub here so we can take kind of a gander at some of these totals. I would say one interesting thing here, JM, is it kind of sets up similar to last week where there's like that one game with a total over 50 that people are very excited about. Dolphins Bills. Last week it was Chargers Vikings. Then you have a couple interesting games in the mid-range and like the 46s here. Vikings Panthers, Rams Colts, I think are pretty intriguing. And then in the later hour you have Raiders and Chargers. But what are some of your kind of like macro thoughts on this slate?
Well, Pete, I'm glad you asked. So you don't have a podcast feed for this, right? It's just on YouTube.
I do.
You do
throw this on a podcast feed. Okay, so in a vacuum podcast feed for the audio listeners. Yeah.
Those of you who just listen on podcast, you can't see the visual here, but basically, to me, it's like there's these games, right, that are the higher confidence games, and same thing with the players, higher confidence players, but the chances of those going for like had to have it setups aren't that high. And then you have like the players and games here that are lower confidence, but there's some spots where it could really like spring up above the higher confidence bets. So to me, this is a very spread out week. And so what I mean by that is what makes the Dolphins so difficult to defend? We could start there. And I'll go through two examples on the higher confidence side and like one or two examples on the lower confidence side, just to kind of give a sense of what I'm saying here. But what makes the Dolphins so difficult to defend is the field stretching ability, the unique way that Mike McDaniel uses motion, and the speed of the Dolphins. And you combine all those things together, and it's really difficult to acclimate to on the field. So I had this quote I tweeted the other day or yesterday from Vance Joseph talking about that game, and he said, you can't simulate that speed in practice, but on Sunday it was overwhelming. The speed was. And he had a few more quotes after that. It was basically like saying how overwhelming it was to face that speed. But we also saw the Patriots in week 2 find a way to slow down this Dolphins team that they've seen a couple times already. The Bills saw this team 3 times last year. So Jordan Poyer out, which obviously hurts the Bills secondary, but like that's the type of game where it won't be surprising if it's 31-27, but the chances of it just going up to like 42-38, right? Becoming one of these just nasty blow up games where all these points are scored are lower than normal. Not to say it can't happen, but it's like pretty high confidence game, right? Josh Allen's going to say, hey, we got to score points here. Let's keep the foot on the gas. But Vic Fangio is going to say, you can't throw downfield against us. And then the Bills are going to say, good job, Josh Allen. You keep taking the underneath throws. Let's praise you every week for that, right? So Bills marching the field. Bills doing the same thing to the Dolphins saying, cool, you have all your speed, but you got to go underneath all game, right? So the chance of it blowing up a little bit hard. Jalen Hurts is another example. Almost certainly going to have a big game against Washington, but, are the Eagles going to be up by 2 or 3 scores in the third quarter yet again, as they have been through 3 games so far? Can Jalen Hurts get to one of these 35, 38-point games where he's being pushed? Probably not, right? It could happen, but the likeliest scenario is he's not going to fail. He's a really solid play. He's going to get you 25 plus points. He can get you that 30, 32-point range. But the chance of him going up to like 38, 40 points where you're like, man, why didn't I have Jalen Hurts, are lower in this spot than normal. On the flip side, you have spots like the Bears and the Broncos, where obviously that game's not going to go overlooked, but it's like, oh, wow, couldn't this game pop off? Couldn't Justin Fields finally have a big game in this spot? Or couldn't the Broncos offense have a big game in this spot? So you're taking on more uncertainty, but that's the type of spot where, maybe Justin Fields is the only quarterback who goes for 35 plus points this week, and Josh Allen goes for 30 and Jalen Hurts goes for 30. And that's kind of where those guys are capped at. And then there's like a lot of pass catchers who are kind of in that same conversation of, man, there's like a much lower floor here, but these guys could ascend for a bigger game. So yeah, it's an interesting week to me in that I don't know that the field is necessarily seeing it this way, but I see it as very spread out. I see it as a week where the highest confidence plays don't have clear pathways to being true bury you for not having them plays. But then the ones that do have those pathways to really burying you for not having them, they also have a lot of holes that they have to avoid in order to hit those types of scores. So it becomes a week where you have to embrace, in my mind, you have to embrace some of that certainty, because you never want like the rosters with 6-7 plays that all have a lot of holes, and you have to avoid holes across all 7 spots. But you also can't just have 8 players that are all kind of safe and comfy and get you that solid score, because somebody's going to have that score that ascends above those, and you have to be hunting for those as well. So it's a very interesting week to me. And it's a week to me that sets up well for MME, but I also feel like as I get into Saturday night, I'll start having a clearer picture of what my tightest pools are going to look like.
Let's, maybe just start here with the quarterback position for this week. You obviously have the 2 big guys at the top, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, both over 8K, project very well. Then you kind of have the rushing quarterbacks, Anthony Richardson, Justin Fields, and then you got the quarterbacks on, pretty efficient offenses that have been known to score a good bit, Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins, Tua, and then you can kind of get down into some more kind of tournament plays, just looking based on projection. What is your quarterback pool looking like this week so far?
I see this week as very much like the division you just laid out, where it's like there are, and I'm going to pull up my exact pool right here, but it's like I see it in 3 different tiers. I see there's the Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts tier, which to me, it's those quarterbacks in the tier, but I'm not arguing against Justin Herbert and some of these other guys, but I obviously prefer the guys who can also add that rushing upside to their floor, right? So Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts tier, where these guys probably don't disappoint. But, can they get up to 35 points? Can they get up to 38 points? Allen probably has a better shot, but I mean, it's impossible to overstate how far out of their way the Bills have gone so far this year, praising Josh Allen for taking the underneath throws, and last week praising him for sliding instead of taking hits downfield. And this is very much what they're wanting Josh Allen to be, is the best version of himself, taking on Vic Fangio, who also kind of pioneered this cover 2 shell that we're seeing everywhere right now, like that's going to try to force teams to work underneath. So, Josh Allen's chances of a 35, 40 pointer lower than they would typically be. He can obviously get there. Same thing with Hurts, game environment where they probably control things. So there's that tier. Then there's the Richardson and Fields tier of these guys in the mid 6Ks who have a lower floor. They need more things to go right, but also it wouldn't be shocking if they end up being the top raw point scorers on the slate. And then to me, there's the sub 6K guys who, if Allen and Hurts both finish in the 25 to 30 point range and Fields and Richardson don't hit, well, all of a sudden, if one of these sub 6K guys goes for 25 points, he ends up being very valuable, because to me, value is pretty thin on this slate. So if you save 2K and get nearly the same score as Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert, those guys, if you get nearly the same score as those guys, so for me, that pool is primarily Matt Stafford, who I think won't get a ton of looks this week from the field. Matt Stafford, Russell Wilson, Brock Purdy, and CJ Stroud. I'm sure there are other guys you could throw in there, but yeah, that's kind of how I see it, is these 3 separate tiers of quarterbacks, and rosters should be built differently to account for which group you're in. Falls nicely in that the pricing kind of matches up as well with how each tier is bunched up there.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting too. And just looking at early kind of ownership projections, it does seem like Richardson and Fields are going to be fairly popular. With Fields, you kind of, wish you were getting a little bit of, the team's been a disaster discount, but it's like the Broncos ruined whatever chance we had of that. I mean, everyone's getting actually pretty excited and talking themselves in to a Justin Fields bounce back. Do you have any thoughts overall? Because I assume when you're referencing some of those 6K, sub 6K guys, I'm guessing Russell Wilson is in that conversation for you.
Yeah, Russell Wilson definitely in that conversation. He had like 56 rushing yards a couple of weeks ago, but he's 35 years old. He doesn't run much anymore. So we basically have to look at him as a pocket passer at this point. What he's getting through the air is what he's going to get for you. But any of those guys that I named could go 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. Stafford's gone over 300 twice already this year. The touchdowns just haven't been there. Opposite Richardson, right? If everybody thinks Richardson is going to have a big game, that means touchdowns being scored. It can't just be the rushing yards. And that means, the Rams keeping pace or the Rams taking the lead and forcing the Colts there. And same thing with Russ. Obviously, you can go for, 250 to 300 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. You get that 303, that's 27 points, right? And that right there, if Hurts and Allen finish in this 25 to 30 point range, that right there kind of unlocks everything for you because you're right there with those guys and saving that salary. And then, Purdy and Stroud are the other guys I kind of have my eye on in that range. I think it's also interesting that the Justin Fields thing, you mentioned, it would be nice to get him at 4% ownership, right? And on our DFS Lab show on Thursday, we were building a roster and we decided to go with Justin Fields. And as we got deeper into that discussion, it started being like, man, but what if Fields goes for 35 or 40? And he's the only guy who does it, right? At the same time, I went back into that Bears film yesterday and it was just like, what is Luke Getsy doing? I mean, I've never seen a square peg round hole situation like this, that coming off a year where they redesigned their whole offense mid-season. We saw Nick Sirianni do this in Jalen Hurts' first year starting, where a couple weeks into the season, they redesigned everything to build it around Jalen Hurts. The Bears did that last year. And they did such an incredible job, like saying, all right, your strengths are not being a pocket passer. And you've got this unique ability with your legs. And they literally went and studied Greg Roman's Ravens film. Greg Roman, who is one of the greatest run game designers in NFL history, extremely creative run game concepts. And they pulled those into the Bears. And then this year they're like, all right, cool. Drop back in the pocket and pass. On top of that, they're like last week, there were so many plays where they were blocking Chris Jones, like with one guy. So Chris Jones is wreaking havoc up the middle. And they don't even think like, hey, this is the one guy who can wreck things up the middle. Let's put two blockers on him. It was just outlandish. And then you see Justin Fields, it's hard to quantify where a player's confidence is at, but you constantly see Justin Fields passing up open slants and open underneath throws, which either means he's just not seeing the field well, or more likely he's so much in his head that he can't just see something and pull the trigger. So I do feel like if you've ever had a losing streak in DFS, that feeling of like you're losing, and then you finally have one week where you just barely profit, or one slate where you just barely profit, and then that kicks off this streak of like winning. And I do kind of feel like Justin Fields is going to need a game where he has that small win first, and then that kicks him off on this bigger streak. And in fact, we saw that last year. There were a couple games where he kind of started getting his legs under him, and then he started blowing up. So I mean, that's obviously the painting the side of how Fields doesn't become a had-to-have-it piece here. At the same time, the Bears coaches are fighting for their jobs. They're going to be looking for ways to improve things. The Broncos coaches are fighting for their jobs too. Vance Joseph has proven in the past he's a solid defensive coordinator. There's no reason to just expect that the Broncos are going to come out and be awful again, but they're not good. They're not scary on defense. And so, even if Fields fails, he probably gets you 20, 21, 22, 24 points, which is really nice at his salary. So it's an interesting spot. I don't know. I'll either probably be like even with the field on him or like way overweight. If he's 10% owned, maybe I'm like 7 or 8%, but I don't know yet like which direction I'm going there. It's a very interesting discussion this week.
One specific quarterback situation I wanted to ask you about before we move on, just because when I was looking at some early optimal lineups, I was seeing Jimmy Garoppolo actually show up in a lot of those. I did just check. It seems like he is still in the concussion protocol today per Adam Schefter. So could be dicey. Like we might legitimately be getting Brian Hoyer this weekend. I know this is a very interesting game for DFS purposes. So I'm just curious, both if Jimmy plays, if he doesn't, like, how are you thinking about the Raiders offense this week? Because Devontae Adams is our cover boy here.
Yeah. So we went with Devontae Adams, huh? So I feel like pressure to put him on our build now, but maybe we won't.
No. The cover boy, there's no pressure. I just like getting someone who's going to be talked about. That's
the cover boy on Thursday morning. And then like last night, it was like, I think I sent you three options, right? Last night it was like, oh, here's some other guys we could have picked. I mean, this offense we've never seen anything as concentrated as this offense. I think the numbers it was something like 55 out of 61 touches last week went to Jacoby or Devontae or Josh Jacobs. So if Jimmy G is playing, that like all three of those guys are very much in play. It's actually very reminiscent of another team on this slate, the Rams, in that Kyren Williams, Puka Nacua, and Tutu Atwell, 9 games among the three of them. Each of them played 3 games, right? 9 games among the 3 of them. 7 of those have produced a score that you would be happy with at their salaries. So when you have like a spot where, again, we always want to turn the math in our favor. We always want to give ourselves fewer things we need to get right. And one of the ways to do that is hunting these concentrated offenses. So, that idea of if Jimmy G plays, and we know the Chargers are going to be able to do a good job against this Raiders defense. If Jimmy G plays, the Raiders probably keep pace enough that at minimum, one of these 3 guys hits for a score you would like to have on your tournament rosters, and potentially 2 of these guys, right? So you can just say like, hey, I'm going to spread these guys across almost all my rosters, which is probably an approach I'll end up taking if Jimmy G is out there. If it's not Jimmy G, I've seen the Brian Hoyer. I grew up in Massachusetts. I've seen the Brian Hoyer show for a long time. Like he's not the guy, right? And especially at this point in his career, it won't surprise me if it's Aiden O'Connell who starts for the Raiders instead. But if that's the case, you probably have a more run-focused game plan and then build some play action off of that. So it would be a little bit harder to get behind these guys. That said, it would be harder for everybody to get behind these guys. So it's an interesting spot in that I could see I'll have exposure to this offense regardless of who is under center. And then the question becomes, how much do you scale the exposure down if it's Hoyer or O'Connell? Because obviously the chances of hitting for a ceiling game are way lower with those guys, but the field will recognize that as well and might overcorrect. So I'll give myself some leeway to still have exposure there, maybe a little bit above what the field will have if it's the other guys, just because of, we're still hunting for ceiling and the ceiling is still there. It's just that the chance of hitting it become a little bit lower.
Before we transition to the top running back plays, want to remind you guys, as always, you can get 20% off your 1-week season subs across all of their subs. They got the full season Inner Circle that includes all the stuff with OWS DFS and the Inner Circle. Does that come with the Bink machine, the optimizer you've been referencing lately?
No, but there's an all access pass that's just Inner Circle and the Bink machine all wrapped into one.
Perfect. And the promo code Pete will get you 20% all of those. Also, as we always say, if you just want to test it out, try that 1-week pass. And I think even JM has promised even a refund. If you're not satisfied with the experience you want out, they'll get you back. So go over there, check it out. As I've mentioned on previous shows, reading through the scroll is a major part of my process on Saturday nights and Sundays, seeing the player grid, seeing who all these guys are on, reading high lows, game theory perspective of the slate. So much good information over there at 1-week season. I got the link down below, pinned in the chat, promo code Pete for 20% off. Jam, let's talk about the running back position this week. I do know we were talking a little bit about the Raiders, Josh Jacobs potentially being in play here with some ambiguity with the quarterback situation. What else is jumping out to you at the running back position?
Yeah, running back is a little bit of a, quarterback. I've mentioned 8 guys, right? My running back pool right now is like 6 or 7 guys, which is pretty small out of, 24 teams playing. And one of them is Austin Eckler, who might not play. One of them is CMC, who I might not have a ton of because we play him more for his certain points than for his ceiling. He has only, 13. If we take away his first game with the 49ers, he has 13 games with this team. I say take away the first game because he was just getting up to speed, and it was that, I think, Thursday night game, and he'd just been traded. Other 13 games, he's only topped 30 points 3 times in 13 games. And he's only topped, I think it's 34.3 points once. So CMC is obviously rock solid. He can go for 40, but in most scenarios, he's getting you 25 to 30, and he costs a lot of salary for that, right? So he's not even a guy who really stands out to me. So, I'm going to potentially expand the pool beyond this and give myself opportunity to build rosters in the Bink machine, shop through them, and have a roster where it's like, this running back's only on 4% of my rosters, 6% of my rosters, but I really like this roster. So it's going into single entry or tight or smaller field stuff, But in terms of like what my actual single entry 3 max pool is, it's pretty small. And so I think that let me see if I can find, I'll see if I can find this quote while I talk through these other 2 guys. But the first 2 guys are Kyron Williams and Zach Moss. Not going to go overlooked by anyone, but just in terms of when we don't have a lot of certainty at the running back position, what I want to be looking for is who has the biggest workloads, who is getting the most opportunity to hit for these games. And then the other guy I want to highlight here is Alexander Madison. This is a quote from Wes Phillips, offensive coordinator of the Vikings, yesterday or 2 days ago. He said, Cam's a talent, talking about Cam Akers. He said, Cam's a talented back, planning on keep mixing him in practice and hopefully get him some ops this week. So that stood out to me as, could be coach speak, but it sounded like, he was just talking from like the flow of his thoughts of like, here's where they asked him about Cam Akers and how he would be getting involved. And that was his answer, right? It was like, we're getting him involved in practice, hopefully get him some ops on the field this week. So I could see Alexander Madison still getting, 65, 70% snap share in a good run game matchup on a team that keeps talking about, how important it is for them to establish the run and be able to build pass concepts off that. So there's other places that you'd go, the Dolphins running backs, the Bills, good run defense, but they're very small. They play primarily nickel base coverage. They're going to be compelled to do that against Miami. Terrell Bernard, who is the replacement for Tremaine Edmonds, has been phenomenal this year. Like there's kind of this expectation that, the Bills linebacking core is going to fall off a little bit without Tremaine Edmonds. Terrell Bernard's been awesome, but he's undersized. Matt Milano's undersized. Last week, heading into the week 3 game, Mike McDaniel said that he believes Raheem Mostert is the strongest pound for pound player on that Dolphins team. So, I mean, you've got a guy with not just speed, but size, a guy who's hard to take down, and you got a nickel based defense and undersized linebackers. So, another spot where Mostert's early ownership projection is like sub 4%.
Yeah.
And it's a good matchup for him. And so if people are excited about that game, but not on Raheem Mostert, he's an interesting piece there. And obviously Achane also has that opportunity to potentially get another 14 touches. And that's a small running back pool. It won't surprise me if I branch off in other directions and kind of find some more pieces, but that's where I'm at right now.
I'm curious about that dynamic because it's something we see play out a bunch. And I guess the examples I'm thinking about right now are generally rookies, but Mostert certainly qualifies where you get this outsized performance. I'm also thinking about like Puka Nacua in week 1, the price goes up and there's both an element of skepticism, like there's no way they can do this again, as well as sticker shock. Like now they cost more. I missed the boat on this. I don't want to be chasing last week's touchdowns. Like, how do you think through that exercise for, say, the Dolphins running backs this week? Because based, like you said, on those early ownership projections, it seems like that's exactly what is happening with both of these guys who are projecting for sub 5%, which again does feel like a unique thing to like 2023 DFS, right? Where 5 years ago it'd be like, hey, I'm just rolling out Mostert and Achane again. Why can't they score 8 touchdowns again? Yeah,
there's also a pricing psychology when you top that 6K mark. There was somebody I was looking at yesterday, and it was like, I like these sub 6K quarterbacks a little bit more. Maybe it was Fields, maybe it was Richardson. And then it was like, this guy's not that much more expensive than these pocket passers down here. It's like, but once you top that 6K mark, there's a different way you look at these players. So the pricing psychology aspect is critical in DFS. And one of the best ways to overcome that is to have a sense of what a player's worth is before the price goes up, right? So we were saying leading into week 1 that when Calvin Ridley and Chris Olave were 6,500, I was saying that within a few weeks, Calvin Ridley will probably be about 7,700. Chris Olave will be 7,400. I was saying since Tank Dell was 3,200, that he should be priced about 4,900. So if you can kind of get a sense of those things before the prices go up, it makes it a little bit easier to then pay those price tags when they're there, because you recognize you're still getting fair value on them. At the same time, we're going to make mistakes in that regard. I made the mistake Cooper Kupp's like ascendant year where it was like, hey, we know who Cooper Kupp is, and now you guys are paying 7K for this guy, and a few weeks later he's 9K, and I'm like, well, yeah, I'll play him at 9K. And so, that's one of those where you're not going to get all of them right, but you have to have that willingness to see what a player's true worth is and have an understanding of that. Obviously, the more you play DFS, the more time you spend with the salaries, the deeper understanding you're going to have of where a player's true value is. And having that ability to kind of step out of the forward momentum of a slate and prep for a slate and say, okay, what is the value of this guy in his role in this offense, how he's being used? And it's also one of those things, I always say, if you're watching this, you don't have to do all this work yourself. Ideally, you're on a site that does this work for you, or you're paying attention to content that does this work for you. And as I often say, Pete mentioned the willingness to refund. the thing with OWS, right? Like we're not for everybody because yes, we identify for you who the top plays are on the slate, but our main focus is on training you how to play DFS, making you a sharper DFS player. Everybody wants to be a sharper DFS player, but a lot of people don't want that in their content, right? What they really want is picks. And so we say, look, maybe we're not for you. You spend a week with us and you want to go somewhere else, ask for a refund, we'll give it to you. So whether it's OWS or whether it's ETR or Roto Grinders, or whether it's just like religiously watching and listening to all of Pete's stuff, like find places that are doing some of that work for you. And then you can build your own thoughts on top of that. But yeah, like I think it can be overwhelming when somebody's trying to start from scratch and do all this thought themselves. And one of the best things you can do, you mentioned reading the scroll every week. I read the scroll every week. I just listened to all the NFL Edge write-ups today where we break down all the games. I listen to Lord Reeves and Hilo's podcast every week. I listen to some other stuff every week where I'm trying to gather as much information and pull in as much information as I can to balance it off of my own information. And aim to do that because that's going to really help you in terms of your play. Actually, as you pull up the scroll, if you don't mind, I want to read real quickly a message I got the other day from Jmtowin, who's one of the all-time great NBA DFS players. Been out of DFS for a couple of years, started playing again this year, but he messaged me about the scroll and he said, my favorite part of OWS is the scroll. He said, most sites have everyone regurgitating the same plays. The scroll has so many unique individual writers with unique perspectives for a variety of contests for construction. Being different is how you win, and hearing 10 entirely different perspectives that are well thought out and articulated gives one all the ammo to make your own decisions with dangerous upside. And I think that's one of the, whether it's, reading the scroll or something else, it's one of the things to keep in mind as a DFS player is you want different perspectives, and then you want to be able to pull those in and balance those off of your own perspective. So maybe 75, 70, 80% of your play is from your own perspectives, but you get that balance of, oh, I heard this over here. I thought of this from what this person said. And those little pieces can be the difference in what's a good weekend or a tremendous weekend, or what's a bad weekend and a good weekend. Finding things like that to balance your thoughts is also really valuable.
Yeah, one thing that I've pulled from you guys and learned from you over the years that I used to not do, and granted it didn't specifically work out last week, but this whole idea of building blocks, which is what kind of this show is named after. And, last week I used ETN and Ridley on the same team, with the idea being, both those guys I thought were going to, not be completely sneaky, but together they were going to have this uniqueness element and being like, could they do a Josh Jacobs, Devontae Adams thing where one guy goes for 35, the other guy gives you 20, and those two in combination give you this, tournament winning score. And so even those kind of ideas that are just conceptual ideas, and then you can mix and match the players you want. Obviously the usage and the situations and game environment have to line up, but it is really fun to kind of pull some of those ideas, especially in the age of Sims where people are using the math to dictate their decisions. To kind of use your own creativity there to land on those unique combos is a fun part of the process. One running back I want to ask you about before we move on to wide receivers, because I saw it come up in the chat a couple of times here, this Eagles backfield, and specifically people asking about DeAndre Swift. Obviously, really interesting usage. He's not used at all in week 1. Week 2, he's the bell cow back with Gainwell out. And then week 3, it's like a 65-35, 60-40 split in favor of DeAndre Swift, who did look much better, looked shot out of a cannon on some of those runs. How are you approaching the Eagles backfield this week?
Yeah, Nick Sirianni isn't messing around here. Like, he's going to get Gainwell his touches. What they went in at halftime with last week? Gainwell had 5 carries and Swift had 4. It's not like, oh, they had the game in hand and now they're resting Swift, and so Gainwell is getting his 14 carries. Like, Gainwell out-carried DeAndre Swift in the first half. So I think that there can be this tendency on our end to say, man, this guy looked awesome, or to criticize a coach as an idiot for not using. It's easy to do that with the Lions right now. Like, like Dan Campbell, Ben Johnson, they're idiots. They're not using Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, why did you draft him? What was it, 8th overall? I don't know that. But also, like, the fact that they can just punish a team throughout a game, you know what that does to a team, like, physically and mentally, to just like play after play get punched and have to keep trying to fight back against that. So these guys know what they're doing in terms of how they want to use these players, how they want to set up the health of their players for their playoff runs. And at this point, it does very much look like Kenneth Gainwell remains an integral part of what they want to do. Again, 14 carries to 16 for DeAndre Swift last week, 5 carries to 4 carries at halftime last week. So yeah, I mean, I like DeAndre Swift because he's so explosive. I also like the fact that Nick Sirianni said this week, he basically talked up Swift's pass game chops. And he said, the game plan hasn't worked out yet for us to use him in that way, but essentially saying we're still going to use him that way. So the pass work hasn't been there, but it will be one week, right? There's going to be a week where he's used more heavily in that way, which is huge for us on PPR sites. And so, yeah, I mean, I like DeAndre Swift. He's kind of on the fringes of my pool. I might have actually listed Eagles backs in my pool, but I also like Kenneth Gainwell as a guy who, it's not sexy. Maybe he gets you 70 yards and 2 catches, but also maybe he gets you those 2 touchdowns down at the goal line. And because Swift has looked so good and his price is still at 5,700, maybe he's, 6-7 times higher owned than Gainwell, but Gainwell ends up putting up a score much higher than what Swift puts up. So yeah, I'm not, it's one of those that when you scroll through everything on this week, it's one of the first players that stands out. And so I recognize that. And I recognize that's going to juice up his ownership a little bit. And I recognize he's not as good of a play as he looks when you're just scrolling through and you're like, what? Swift 5,700? Yeah. At the same time, like, can Swift go for 30 points? He's in that bucket, right? Yep. So that's kind of my Saturday night process when I'm building my MME pool is who are the guys who can go for 30 that might not be in my tighter pool? And then my pool kind of starts expanding a little bit to include those guys. And maybe those guys end up on tighter builds where I didn't expect them to. So Swift is kind of in that bucket for me right now of, can he put up 12 points? Yeah. And everybody's going to be like, man, how did he only put up 12 points? But also he can put up 30, 35 points. So interesting setup. And just kind of understand like how the Eagles are using that backfield.
Before we get to wide receivers and then build a lineup on DraftKings with some of JM's favorite building blocks for the week, want to mention Steph becoming a YouTube member here. If you guys are hand builders and Opto Bros, get you multiple things, get you access to the private hand builders and Opto Bro Discord within the Deposit Kingdom. You just sync your YouTube and Discord account. It will unlock that channel. On top of that, you get 2 premium shows a week. You get the After Dark interview show on Saturday. My guest this week is Sammy Reed. You guys might know him from the Gilcast, from his terrific poker podcast, Read 'em and Weep. Excited to talk with Sammy and then build a lineup or 2 for kicks. And then on Sunday morning, you get the week 4 GPP cram that kicks off at 10:45 a.m. It goes through inactives. We break down the slate, the overnight news, all of the inactives, all of that good stuff. We'll get you those 2 premium shows. If you want to become a YouTube member and support the channel, JM, let's talk about wide receiver, because you mentioned it before too, not a ton of value on this slate and specifically at the wide receiver position. We have lots of fun stuff on the high end. You got, Justin Jefferson, who's almost cost prohibitive, maybe. Well, you could talk about that at 9,600. You got the 2 big dogs in this Dolphins Bills game in Hill and Diggs. And then you have like 8 or 9 guys in the 7K range who all have the potential to go off. You're going to have to make some tough decisions at wide receiver this week. What are you thinking?
Yeah. And also I want to throw this one out there. Jerry Jeudy currently projecting for like sub 1% ownership after, catching fire down the stretch run last year and all these like 25 to 30 point games. Yeah. There's wide receiver. You said it, it's the top end is very attractive. Obviously that means that a lot of rosters will be built similarly, trying to squeeze in 1 or 2 of these top end guys. But in terms of just what's optimal on this slate, yeah, like kind of getting the Kyron Williams and the Zach Moss type plays and then fitting in a couple of these higher priced guys. And then, we're seeing guys like Josh Downs and Calvin Austin popping in ownership projections right now because they're popping in optimizers, because it's like, well, these guys are on the field and they're going to get 5 to 7 targets and it allows you to fit in these other guys. So you got to recognize what the typical roster construction will look like and how you might be able to leverage that to your advantage. Obviously, Hilo always breaks that down in the end around in terms of, hey, here are some of the other ways we can build this week to just have totally different construction, but also just on paper, that is the way to build. And so, yeah, for me, a lot of these guys, it's attached to what I'm doing at quarterback. So I probably won't have, if Diggs hits, Josh Allen's hitting. Like that's almost a given. And not to say that, you couldn't get Diggs for 30 points and pass up on the 30 points you get with Josh Allen and then go down in price and maybe get 25 points from one of these cheaper quarterbacks. Like you can do that. But generally speaking, if I'm getting 2 spots right with 1 bet, I want to just take advantage of that. I want to put the math in my favor. So like a guy like Diggs, if I'm playing him, it's probably with Josh Allen. A guy like AJ Brown, if I'm playing him, it's probably with Jalen Hurts. But then there's also guys like Jamar Chase, who we don't even need to get into this Tennessee matchup for pass catchers because we've done it every week so far. But yeah, we know how great that matchup is. I probably don't want Burrow because, 6,500, is he going to get, is he going to throw for 4 touchdown passes? Probably what he needs. He's not going to be running on that calf. So he's got to get 300 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. So I'm probably not going Burrow, but I can go Chase, right? That's concentrated offense, and you can have these big games. And same thing with Devontae and Keenan Allen, Josh Palmer. I really like Josh Palmer this week. 40 snaps last week to 16 for Quentin Johnston. And especially if Austin Eckler is out, I think we see, if Eckler's in, most of the schemed usage is going to be Keenan and Eckler. But if Eckler's out, you got to have at least 2 guys you're scheming usage for, and that puts Palmer at the forefront. Also, it's worth noting the Raiders have fantasy points data. Shout out to Scott Barrett. The Raiders have faced, I believe it's the lowest first read rate in the NFL. And they've really kind of gone out of their way last week. They put 2 guys on George Pickens almost the entire game. They've really kind of gone out of their way to say, all right, we'll take away your top guy. Well, what clearer spot for them to do that than this week against Keenan Allen? So at the same time, when you're doubling a guy, he still just has to win leverage on one guy, because if he wins leverage on one guy, then that creates that open space on the field. Right? If they're over under, if they're inside outside, well, if he gets leverage on that inside guy, he's still open to the inside. So it's not like Keenan Allen can be doubled and not get open. Justin Jefferson's doubled almost every play, and he's still getting open all the time. But something to think about there, right? Can Keenan Allen, whose ADOT is still the same as it's always been, around 8.5 yards per target. So can Keenan Allen have a 15 to 18 target game or a multi-touchdown game, which is what he'll typically end up needing to do. So Josh Palmer becomes very interesting this week. But yeah, it's kind of, for me, it's like there's a few spots that kind of stand out separate from the quarterbacks and a few spots that will be very much attached to the quarterbacks.
Yeah, you mentioned Joshua Palmer. We say how there's not a lot of value on this slate. I do envision Joshua Palmer to be very popular just at 4K. People like this game. He's produced already, seems to be holding off Quentin Johnston for now. Some other names, sub 5K, that it seems like people might be willing to use. Adam Thielen, who's been on a tear lately at 4,500. Josh Downs is kind of interesting, coming off an 11 target game at 3,500. Tank Dell, maybe still in the conversation here at 4,600. Are there any other salary relief guys you're considering? Do we have the 1 week early on the Tank Dell special here?
I don't see anything like that this week. I think Marvin Mims, there's been whispers. I was texting Scott Barrett about this yesterday to see if I can get any more information from him, if he was getting any information from Broncos beat writers that he knows. But there have been whispers from Broncos beat writers that Mims is going to have a larger role this week. So Scott, without like any authoritative knowledge, just said, I'd estimate it's maybe like 40% of the snaps or something like that. That's a huge jump up from, 15 snaps. And so that's kind of an interesting spot where we could be a week early instead of late. And I'll definitely have some Marvin Mims this week, and we can put a feather in our cap if he ends up having a more usage in a huge game, because he is seeing, he had 5 targets last week on, I think it was 15 snaps or 17 snaps. So when he's out there, they're trying to get him the ball. It'd be great if he was out there a little bit more. But yeah, Calvin Austin is popping in projections. Bad matchup, but he can score from anywhere in the field. So I can't talk that play down, so to speak. Josh Downs, probably a guy I won't be on, just because, his chances of topping 35 or 40 yards in this role aren't high. You're playing him more for the safety than for the ceiling. But there's nobody else that I'm seeing as like, oh, this guy's going to be priced quite a bit higher in a couple of weeks than he is now, which just makes it a tough week for value for sure.
Yeah, why don't we kind of continue the wide receiver conversation as we build out a lineup on DraftKings. It is time for the building blocks, DraftKings build. As I mentioned before, we still got some spots in the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League. This is a $10 single entry rake-free contest on DraftKings. This link is posted exclusively in the announcement section of the Deposit Kingdom Discord. We got 81 spots left. Geez, I can't do math. 89 spots left. I'm really struggling with that. 91 spots. Geez, I called you Justin. I can't do basic math. Rough show for me today, JM here. But I feel like heading into this one, normally you and we talk a little bit. I know some of your building blocks, which ways you're leaning. I feel like I don't know where JM is at this week. What are you going to get us started with here?
No, I feel like I don't know either. And that's kind of the state of this week is like I said, the sharp plays, like the little less sharp plays, they do have a little bit more ceiling in some of these spots. So I want to blend those two things. Like, what is one of the higher confidence plays and blend it with what is one of the lower confidence plays with really high upside. And so this block that I really like, I think in the player grid, I named it, not I think, I'm going to look it up. In the player grid, I named it Overlooked, really. And that is Josh Allen paired with Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs with Raheem Mostert as the bring back, which gives us, again, Allen won't be unpopular. Diggs won't be unpopular. But there are high-priced wide receivers who stand out a little bit more than those guys. And then we know that Mostert is coming in with low ownership projections. And so that means that this combinatorially, this block will be very low owned. Obviously, we significantly restrict our salary with this setup, but it gives us a really nice starting point and allows us to kind of poke around on this value a little bit as well to see what we want to do on the rest of our roster.
Yeah, and did we do a similar block? Was it week 1? Did we do like an Allen, Diggs,
week
Kincaid?
2? It was one of these weeks.
Yeah,
it was where we had Diggs, Davis, Diggs, and Allen. And you know what? Like, there's going to be 3 or 4 weeks this year where this hits, and so it's one of those things where almost every week I'm going to have this combination on some of my rosters. And there's going to be one of these weeks where I'm knocking on the door for first place in large field play because of this. And ideally, that'll be a week where some of these rosters pop for me in smaller field stuff as well. I'm like, I really like this one, and can kind of double up on the winnings when it happens.
Yeah. How do you think about the Bills right now? Because I would say, like, my knee-jerk reaction, even without like looking into the numbers, is like, we've been getting some of these high target share games from Diggs, but other than that, it's been like really spread out. And even we see Gabe Davis get in the end zone. He hasn't obviously popped off yet. We've seen a lot of people kind of hoping that Dalton Kincaid gets going, Dawson Knox mixing in, James Cook has been involved in the passing game. How are you thinking about like this offense potentially concentrating and allowing these guys at these prices to both kind of coexist in your lineup together?
Well, we're also seeing you had the Jets week 1, which is a really tough matchup, and then kind of an anomaly of a game given the way that the Bills played, and then back-to-back blowout wins, 38-10, 37-3. So we really haven't gotten to see this Bills offense in a truly competitive, higher scoring type of atmosphere. And this game, it brought to mind the quarterback's documentary on Netflix when Patrick Mahomes was facing Tom Brady last year. And he talked in the week leading up to that game about how when you're facing a quarterback like Tom Brady, you know that no lead is safe. And so when you're on offense, you want to be extra aggressive and really make sure you're putting points on the board. And that definitely applies to this type of spot. So it won't be surprising if the Bills are able to find their way to 30 plus points again in this spot. And because Vic Fangio is going to try to force Josh Allen to work underneath, that can elevate that volume as well. So pick up those extra targets for somebody like Stephon Diggs or even Dalton Kincaid. Like, a lot of my rosters, not a lot, but a good like 6%, 5% of my rosters last week had Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and Donald Parham, because Parham was 2,700, and it's like, he can score the touchdowns. So I don't mind having a Dalton Kincaid on here as well, where you save the salary. The touchdowns could go to him. Tight end is extremely thin this week, and you kind of free up some stuff for other spots. So it's kind of how I'm looking at it is, can this offense hit in this setup? Absolutely. And in terms of Gabe Davis, like, he's never going to be an 11, 12 target guy. It's more about what can he do on those 7 or 8 targets, and he can score 2 touchdowns on those 7 or 8 targets. You hope for a setup where Diggs is catching 9 passes for 120 yards and a score, something like that. But then Gabe Davis is getting a big play and 2 touchdowns, and it ends up all coming together.
So I like this. This is the classic spot. We're now going to need to save some money. We mentioned that there isn't a ton of value at wide receiver, so I'm guessing we're going to have to do that with tight end in defense. Normally we do kind of talk, is there a defense placeholder that you like using here that could save us some money? Browns at 2,800 kind of feel like the Jets from last week are in a comfy spot. Anything else jump out to you?
No, I mean, in terms of cheaper defenses, it's definitely the cheapest one I like is the Browns. I mean, they've been so good, and not really surprising with Jim Schwartz there and the talent that they have and the talent that they've brought in. If we had a different roster construction, the Eagles are very interesting this week because everybody knows the Eagles are interesting on defense, but they don't typically want to pay up for it.
Yeah.
I think that the Chargers are very interesting, even if Jimmy Garoppolo is playing, but especially if Jimmy Garoppolo isn't, as a defense, most people won't be looking toward. It's funny, I had like 2% Chargers defense last week as like a hedge off of my exposure to that game, and ended up like they put up 8 points, I think it was, even though that game ended up being, higher scoring. So Chargers defense capable of doing something in this spot. I think the Vikings are really interesting this week because everybody's down on them. They're not super talented, but they blitz so much and throw so many exotic looks at a quarterback that I could see Bryce Young having a hard time with them. Obviously, that's like more of a home run swing where you probably get a bad score, but maybe you get a really good score. But on this roster, let's go ahead and throw in the Browns defense. We don't, or the Chargers, either way. But yeah, we don't have to worry too much about ownership at this point because of how unique our core is. And so taking kind of that cheapest one and seeing what that frees up for us is a nice way to go.
Yeah, we'll put in Browns for now. I do love the idea of if we have the salary getting up to Chargers, just as, hey, that game has a high total. It's going to be popular, from a lot of spots. That's a nice way to play that game kind of failing if the field is going there in a lot of other directions. Do you want to talk about tight end? We haven't hit on that yet. Is there a play that's jumping out to you? It is, as always, kind of wide open at the position. I know people are starting to get pretty excited about George Kittle. Deebo Samuel's been questionable this week. Even Ayuk has still been banged up. You got the cheapies, Pat Freiermuth and Zach Ertz, who look like they're going to be popular. And then other than that, it's kind of the Wild West.
Yeah, I mean, it's about as ugly as it can be at the tight end position. If Deebo's out, George Kittle is obviously an excellent play. It's so obvious that people will be on him, but I like George Kittle a lot this week. On this roster where we know that wide receiver value is thin, and I don't want to be taking, there's some really solid running backs available. There's Zach Moss and Kyron Williams available at 6K. So I don't want to be going down to like the 5,300 backs or 5,200 backs. So I want to make sure that I have the salary for a running back. So what I would probably do here is put in Dalton Kincaid as a placeholder, and then put in the running back that I want, and then see like, okay, is there a way to get up to George Kittle by, if our final wide receiver is like not much better than the cheap guy we can take, then we can say, well, let's go up to George Kittle and get some certainty there and go to another cheap wide receiver.
Do you have a favorite between Kyron Williams, Zach Moss, same price, similar workload, same game? It's kind of the Spider-Man meme here.
The Kyron Williams pass game role probably makes him a little bit more attractive to me. I don't really have a strong lean. I do know that I will probably have at least one Rams piece, Tutu and Puka and Kyron Williams. I'll probably have at least one of those three, or exactly one of those three, on like 90% of my rosters, just because the chances of all three of those guys failing are extremely low, and the chances of like two of them putting up at least a solid score pretty high, maybe all three of them. So I like getting one of the Rams pieces on here. And that kind of sends us to, like, right now we're obviously taking a home run swing on Gabe Davis and Raheem Mostert, but as part of our central thesis. And right now I really kind of like the stability of this roster. And I would love to add one more kind of stable piece in Josh Palmer. And then that allows us to see, like, do we want to go with the like 5,300 wide receivers or something at 5,300 that we can actually really get behind? Or do we want to say, hey, let's free up the extra 1,900 and go up to George Kittle and just go like eat the chalk at Calvin Austin, knowing that he's going to get, 5-6 targets and he can score from anywhere on the field. He's not a bad play. He's not great chalk. He's fragile chalk. But if it allows you to do what you want to do elsewhere, it's worthwhile. So that's kind of the balance that I would be at this point. In this range,
yeah, it's pretty gross.
Yeah, and I think that there's going to be a tendency for people. I said Judy's projecting under 1% owned, and yet people are on that game, right? In fact, when I was looking at ownership projections yesterday, Russell Wilson was projected higher than like Sutton plus Judy combined. I don't know how that could end up being possible, but I do think that people will just like totally lean towards Sutton. He was showing like 9%. And Judy was showing under 1%. because Sutton had an 11 target game, but that was one game, right? And so
he also looked awful too. Made a ton of mistakes.
He's not those the holding the ball out away from his body and just soft fumbles. And it was who was it? Maybe it was Sean Payton said that, you know, when you're down in a game like that, it was Joe Lombardi. So when you're down in a game like that, like sometimes players start pressing, right? And they're just trying to make a big play and they make mistakes as a result. It was like, it didn't look like Sutton was pressing. It looked like he was like, here you go, guys, you can have the ball. I kind of like the idea of going down to Calvin Austin and going up to George Kittle.
Yeah.
And what I like about this roster is, all right, we've got the chalky cheap guys in Calvin Austin and Josh Palmer. We've got the chalky defense in the Browns. We've got the chalky tight end in George Kittle. But the way we're building, and Kyron Williams is going to be popular as well, but the way we're building this roster and the way we're betting on Bills and Dolphins being the had-to-have-it game.
Yep.
On a week where there's not a clear had-to-have-it game. And if it ends up happening, Gabe Davis and Raheem Mostert are so low owned, and then the combinatorial ownership of that block is so low that it really doesn't matter that we're hitting chalk elsewhere on the roster. And this is another roster where I look at it and I'm like, oh, I can see myself using this exact roster, right? Just because it balances what's popular with what's unpopular in a way that, like, what's unpopular could be what separates us from the field. And so it doesn't force us to kind of take Calvin Austin's thin, but so are the other cheap plays. Right. And so this is one of those spots where we can say, look, we'll just ride the chalk here because we're doing something so different with this starting building block on this roster. Kind of sets us up nicely for smaller field and mid-sized tournaments. I probably wouldn't play it in the Millie Maker, but this is a great roster for, anything from the slant down. I would be happy with this roster.
Yeah, I like this one. As always, this lineup is not financial advice. It is meant to be a practice build. It is meant to give you ideas for your builds. I saw lots of comments last week, JM. There was like, I built the exact same lineup you guys made on stream, and then I had to start over from scratch. So, don't get married to a lineup on a Friday afternoon. Speaking of Friday afternoons, immediately after this, and we're wrapping it up here, I'm headed over to the Underdog Daily channel. We are doing Off and On the Clock, the show I do on Fridays with the Badge Bros. We'll talk Battle Royale strategy, hop in some Dog Bowl qualifiers, got to chase Nez and all these guys in the Deposit Kingdom who keep winning tickets to Miami. So head over there. You can also just refresh right here. But JM, any final words before we pack it up for week 4 block party?
Be aware of what this week provides. Adjust your play accordingly. Swing through 1 week season. Try a week pass. If you don't like it, if it's not for you, ask for a refund next week and you get the week for free. That's it from me. Excited to see you guys at the tops of the leaderboards on Sunday.
Yep. Check out 1 week season, a ton of content getting populated on the site over the next 24 hours. You can't miss it. It has been helping my process in a big, big way. I will see you guys over on the Underdog Daily channel. I will see you tomorrow night for DFS After Dark with Sammy Reed. And then I will see you on Sunday for the Cram. For JM, I'm Pete. Good luck this week, guys.